You know, usually when we think about farming, we expect things to be very, like, grounded in the dirt.
Right, yeah. Crop yields, soil types, that sort of thing.
Exactly, maybe weather patterns. We definitely do not expect an ancient agricultural rule about resting soil to somehow mathematically explain a massive multi-city stadium gathering.
Deep in the heart of Nigeria.
Right. Thousands of years later.
Yeah.
It's just wild.
It is, it's certainly not a typical straight line to draw, you know? It requires this highly specific lens to look at ancient history and extract an equation that is actively being used to mobilize a modern crowd.
But that equation is exactly what we are unpacking for you today in this deep dive.
Yeah.
We're looking at a really in-depth analysis of a sermon.
A very specific one, yeah.
Right, it's titled The Perfect Fulfillment of the Word of the Lord. And this was delivered by Pastor Dr. W. F. Kumuyi of the Deeper Christian Life Ministry.
On June 4th, 2026.
Yes, exactly. And, you know, we have a really interesting stack of sources for this one, which is exciting. We've got the raw transcript of the actual YouTube broadcast of the revival service.
Which is great.
It is. Plus, we have the official PDF sermon outline that was provided to the ministers.
And that gives us this incredible dual perspective. We get to see the rigid architecture of what was actually written on the page versus the, you know, the dynamic energy of how it was delivered to the live crowd.
Right, how it actually sounded in the room.
Right.
And just to be completely clear with you right up front, we're stepping into this deep dive as your impartial guides.
Absolutely.
Because we're analyzing a text built around very specific religious doctrine. Our mission here is not to, like, endorse or validate or debate the theology itself.
No, we aren't here to tell you what to believe.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We really just want to understand the underlying mechanics of it all.
Yeah, we're looking at the rhetorical structures the speaker uses, right? How the sermon interprets these historical biblical events, and ultimately how those interpretations function as this massive organizational mobilization strategy.
Which is the most fascinating part to me. And to understand where this sermon is going, which is a huge promise about the future, we first have to kind of look backward.
Right. The sermon spends a lot of time establishing how it views the past.
Yeah. And it starts with this mathematical explanation for the Babylonian captivity. It literally traces all the way back to dirt and farming.
It does. The premise presented here is that the ancient people of Judah were given a very specific, uncompromising command regarding their agriculture.
Okay.
They were supposed to work their land, you know, cultivate it, harvest their crops for 6 years.
Yeah.
But the 7th year was meant to be a year of complete rest for the land.
Like a sabbatical.
Exactly. A mandated sabbatical for the soil, no working, no cultivation whatsoever.
But the people of Judah completely ignored this rule, right, according to the text.
Completely. They just kept farming year after year, century after century.
For like 490 years. And this is where the math comes in and where the worldview of this sermon really starts to crystallize for the listener.
Right, because if you do the math.
Right, 490 divided by 7 equals exactly 70. The argument here is that because they skipped their required rest for 490 years, they literally owed the land exactly 70 years of rest.
And the theology presented here is that God is essentially an ultimate auditor who balances the books.
Wow, yeah.
The sermon argues that God forced the land to rest for those exact 70 years by sending the entire population into the Babylonian captivity.
Which is a huge historical event.
Right. There is a specific line from Pastor Kumuyi that perfectly captures this framework. He says, God will always have his way. It's either you give it to him voluntarily or compulsorily.
Man, I found that line so fascinating because it translates this vast, cosmic event into such a relatable, almost corporate concept.
Corporate? How so?
Well, it's like spiritual forced PTO or like compound interest on a massive debt. If you don't take the break voluntarily, the system simply forces it on you.
That's a really good way to put it.
But, as I was reading through the transcript, I realized there's a huge catch to this math.
What's that?
Well, when those 70 years of captivity are finally up, the people are still sitting in Babylon. Like, the debt is technically paid, the math is totally settled, but the cell door doesn't just automatically swing open for them.
Yes. And that is the crucial pivot in the entire sermon.
Okay.
It moves from this rigid mathematical punishment to a deeply psychological requirement. The sermon introduces a concept it calls stirring.
Stirring.
Right. Drawing heavily from the book of Ezra, specifically chapter 1, verses 1 through 5, it notes that even though the 70 years of punishment were officially over, absolutely nothing happened in reality until God stirred up the spirit of King Cyrus of Persia to let them go.
Wait, so the king had to be stirred first?
Exactly. And even more importantly, nothing happened until the captive people had their own spirit stir to actually get up and leave.
Oh, right. Having the legal permission to leave just wasn't enough.
Yes. Oh.
The transcript uses these incredibly tactile, visceral words to describe this stirring. I remember it says a person must be quickened, jolted, pinched, and aroused. It paints passivity as a fundamental failure.
It does. It raises a vital question about human agency within this specific framework.
Right.
You can have all the promises in the world, the mathematical debt can be entirely cleared, the gates can literally be wide open.
But you're still just sitting there.
Exactly. The sermon insists that a person cannot just sit around waiting for promises to magically fall into their lap. Without that internal stirring, the external freedom means absolutely nothing.
You remain a captive in your own mind.
Precisely.
Which I think really sets up the core architecture of the entire message. Once it establishes that a person must be internally jolted out of their complacency, it has to define exactly what they're supposed to be acting upon.
All right, what are they reacting to?
Yeah, and Pastor Kumuyi structures this around three distinct pillars, which he calls the 3 Ps: prophecy, promise, and performance.
The rhetorical structure of these 3 pillars is highly deliberate. It is engineered to build absolute, unshakable certainty in the mind of the listener.
So let's break those down. It starts with the first pillar, the unchangeable prophecy.
Right. And for this, the sermon points back to the book of Isaiah, specifically chapter 44. It claims that King Cyrus of Persia, the foreign king who eventually lets the captives go, was specifically named by the prophet Isaiah.
Like by name.
By name. Anywhere from 160 to 200 years before Cyrus was even born.
That's incredible to think about just from a narrative perspective.
Right, and think about how that functions rhetorically for someone sitting in the audience.
Yeah.
By highlighting a prophecy that supposedly named a foreign king 2 centuries before his birth, the sermon is establishing a universe where the future is already intricately planned, documented, and totally inevitable.
It explicitly tells the listener, like, you are not an accident.
Exactly. The message is, God knew you were coming to this world, and he made preparation for you. It frames destiny as something concrete and totally unchangeable.
And I guess once you buy into the idea that the prophecy is unchangeable, you naturally have to look at what was actually promised to you in the first place. Which brings us to the second pillar, the unfailing promise.
The unfailing promise, right. The sermon pulls from Jeremiah 29.1 here, that famous verse about God having thoughts of peace and an expected end, promising to turn away captivity.
But it doesn't leave those promises trapped in ancient history, right?
No, it bridges them directly to the New Testament. It specifically references Hebrews 8.6 to argue that modern believers actually have a better covenant built on better promises.
It's almost like a contract upgrade.
That's exactly it. The underlying logic there is very legalistic. It implies that if God kept his promise to the people of Judah under the old contract,
Then he has to keep it now.
right, he is bound by an even stronger, legally binding contract to keep his promises to you today.
But the third pillar is where the rubber really meets the road for me. We have prophecy, we have promise, but the third P is the undeniable performance.
Performance, yeah.
This is the actual physical manifestation of those promises happening in real life. And to illustrate this, the sermon uses this incredibly vivid story from Acts 16 about Paul and Silas in prison.
It is arguably the most powerful metaphor in the entire transcript.
It really is cinematic.
Yeah.
So Paul and Silas are locked in this deep prison, and at midnight they are praying and singing.
Right.
Suddenly there's this massive earthquake. The foundations shake, and the text emphasizes that immediately all the doors were opened and everyone's bands were loosed.
Not just Paul and Silas.
Exactly. Not just them. Every single prisoner in that jail had their chains fall off and their cell doors swing wide open.
The jailer even wakes up, sees the open doors, and is about to fall on his own sword because he assumes everyone has already escaped into the night.
But they haven't. Paul yells out, "Do thyself no harm, for we are all here."
They're all still there.
Right. And the sermon hones in on this exact detail. Why were they all still sitting there? The doors were open. The chains are off. The earthquake had done its job.
Right.
The argument is that the other prisoners stayed sitting in the dark because their spirits weren't stirred, like we talked about earlier. They were physically free, but psychologically they were still totally immobilized.
It is a profound psychological metaphor, and it directly connects back to the concept of the Babylonian captivity.
Oh, how so?
Well, the text says, release by action, by demonstration was given unto everyone, but nobody stirred up himself to escape. It operates as a stark warning to the listener.
Like, don't be those guys.
Exactly. God can provide the earthquake, he can shatter the chains, he can open the door, but he will not physically drag you out of the cell. You have to walk out yourself.
You know, reading this, I kept thinking of it like holding a winning lottery ticket.
A lottery ticket, okay.
Yeah, like the unchangeable prophecy and the unfailing promise mean you are holding the slip of paper with the 6 winning numbers. The money is legally, irrefutably yours. But the undeniable performance, the actual cash hitting your bank account, requires you to physically get off the couch, drive to the lottery office, and hand them the ticket. You have to be stirred to claim it.
That's a great analogy. And taking your lottery ticket idea a step further, the sermon isn't just asking them to cash a hypothetical ticket. It is asking them to cash it in the middle of a very real economic crisis.
Right. And that was actually the biggest question I had while looking through the outline. Like, how does a guy living in Nigeria in 2026 relate to ancient Persian kings and Babylonian farming math?
It can feel very disconnected.
Exactly. But then I hit the section where Pastor Kumuyi starts listing out these incredibly mundane, crushing everyday stresses.
Yes, the 2026 context.
He explicitly tells the listeners not to fear about what they're going to eat tomorrow or what they will wear. He zeroes in on the anxiety of paying school fees, the fear of paying rent to demanding landlords.
He mentions the economy, too.
Yeah, the state of the national economy, educational policies, and even the politicians currently in charge. He covers it all.
And by grounding the sermon in those specific, immediate fears, he is framing modern economic anxiety and bureaucratic red tape as the new Babylon.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the demanding landlord or the failing economy is the modern captivity. And what is fascinating here is how the sermon frames divine performance as an ultimate override code to these human socioeconomic systems.
He literally says that circumstances, the economy of the country, and politicians cannot reverse the blessing.
Exactly. It offers a theology where the believer is assured that divine intervention will completely bypass the financial systems that currently oppress them.
It just sidesteps them.
Right. It takes the power away from the landlord or the politician and places it back in this cosmic, unchangeable timeline.
Which brings us to the ultimate application of this entire deep dive. This entire theology of stirring and performance isn't just theoretical.
No, not at all.
When you look at the dates and the context in the source material, it becomes really clear that this message is the ideological engine meant to mobilize thousands upon thousands of people for a monumental logistical event.
This sermon is essentially the strategic preamble to the global crusade with Kumuyi.
The GCK.
Right, the GCK, taking place across Benue State, Nigeria, throughout June and July of 2026.
And the logistical scale detailed in the text is just staggering. It's not just one big stadium show on a Sunday.
Yeah.
It is a moving wave of mobilization across the entire state.
Just look at the itinerary.
I know, just listen to this. It starts in the city of Makurdi, running from June 24th to the 28th at IBB Square. Then, the whole massive operation packs up and moves to Giboko, from June 30th to July 2nd at the police field.
That's a massive turnaround.
Right. And then it moves again to Atukpo from July 3rd to the 6th at the Deeper Life New Conference Center.
And we are not just talking about evening crusades for the general public either.
What else is there?
Embedded within this massive movement, they are running specialized, highly targeted events. They have the All Believers and Ministers Conference.
Wow.
Yeah, and they're utilizing intense thematic language for it, like purged for higher service and transformed for effective ministry.
And they are also running the Impact Academy, which is specifically targeted at the youth generation.
The youth component is huge.
The rhetoric used for the youth in this outline is particularly striking to me. The text declares this generation the unbreakable breaker. It tells them they cannot be stopped or shut down by the systems around them.
When you look at the mechanism of persuasion here, that phrase, the unbreakable breaker, is brilliant.
Really? Why?
Because in a socioeconomic environment where young people might feel entirely broken by unemployment or a lack of opportunity, the sermon flips the narrative.
Oh, I see.
It empowers them, giving them an identity of unstoppable force. It's very compelling.
But imagine the sheer organizational effort behind this. Moving a multi-day, multi-tiered event across 3 different cities in a single state over just a couple of weeks.
It's a huge undertaking.
It requires thousands of people to travel, take time off work, and gather in these spaces. And it made me realize why the theology of stirring is so functionally necessary for an event like this.
Yes, it perfectly aligns theological belief with physical, geographic action.
Right.
By preaching that miracles, whether that is physical healing, getting out of crushing debt, or finding peace, require an active spurring of the spirit and a complete refusal to remain passive, the sermon primes the listener to physically move.
Because if you just stayed home, you were exactly like the prisoners sitting in the dark, open jail cell in Act 16.
Precisely, the rhetorical trap is set perfectly.
Wow.
The sermon creates a paradigm where staying home is equated with spiritual passivity. It means you are ignoring the earthquake and refusing to walk out of the cell.
So showing up is the proof.
Exactly. Going to the crusade in Makurdi, Gaboko, or Otukpo is framed as the ultimate, tangible proof that a believer's spirit has indeed been stirred.
That makes so much sense.
The physical act of traveling to IBB Square or the police field becomes the demonstration that you are ready to claim the promises God has written for you since before you were born. It turns physical attendance into an absolute act of faith.
Man, it really is a masterclass in connecting ancient scripture to modern logistics.
It really is.
To bring this all together for you listening, we've journeyed from the ancient math of a 70-year forced sabbatical to the psychological necessity of being jolted awake.
Right.
We've walked through the 3 Ps of unchangeable prophecy, unfailing promise, and undeniable performance. And we've seen how all of that ancient history is meticulously woven into a modern-day mobilization strategy.
Designed to physically move thousands of people across Benny State in the face of very real economic anxiety.
Exactly. It clearly demonstrates how text and theology do not exist in a vacuum, do they?
No, they are active, potent tools. They're used to shape human behavior, interpret modern struggles, and drive real-world action.
And, regardless of your personal beliefs, the text poses a really fascinating question about human nature. It asks us to look closely at that story of Paul and Silas. How often do we sit passively in our own open prisons, whether that's a dead-end job, a toxic situation, or just our own paralyzing anxiety, simply because we haven't found the internal spark, that stirring, to actually stand up and walk out the door?
That is a powerful takeaway. The chains might be gone, the mathematical debt might be paid, but the mindset of captivity remains.
Exactly.
And I want to leave you with one final lingering thought based on a very specific, almost hidden note in the PDF source outline.
Oh, what that?
Well, when discussing King Cyrus, the text points out something fascinating about the biblical record itself. It notes that the Book of Ezra and the Book of 2 Chronicles repeat the exact same phrasing about King Cyrus making his proclamation.
Like verbatim.
Almost word for word.
Why point out a clerical repetition like that to a huge crowd?
Because the sermon claims this repetition is a deliberate tool used by the ancient authors to assure us that the promise will not fail.
Oh, I see.
It relies on the fundamental idea that spoken words have actual weight, and repeated words build reality. It argues that ancient spoken prophecies have the power to shape physical reality centuries later.
Wow. If you believe the words spoken 200 years ago can open a prison door today, that changes how you view language entirely.
Exactly. So this raises an important question for you to mull over on your own. If language has that much tangible power, how much power is hidden in the repetitive stories, the daily narratives, and the internal prophecies you speak over your own life every single day?
That's a great question. What are the repeated phrases you use to define your own future?
Are you repeating a prophecy of captivity or a prophecy of release?
Maybe it's time we stop waiting for the cosmic math to balance, stop waiting for forced PTO, and start stirring our own soil. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. Stay curious.